Milton is staring at a jar of pasta sauce in aisle 4, and he has no idea who the hell he is. He's 44 years old, he's a senior vice president with a corner office that overlooks the skyline, and he's currently paralyzed by a choice between marinara and roasted garlic. It sounds ridiculous, right? It sounds like a punchline, but if you're a man over 40 and you've just heard the words, "I want a divorce," you know exactly what Milton is feeling. It's not about the sauce. It's about the fact that for 22 years, his taste buds were a committee, his identity was a joint venture. And now, the board of directors has dissolved, the office is empty, and he is standing in a fluorescent-lit grocery store realizing he is a ghost in a tailored suit. If you feel like you're vanishing, if you look in the mirror and see a stranger where a husband used to be, you need to stay with me until the very end of this story. Because what happened to Milton in the next 30 days wasn't just a recovery, it was a resurrection. And the secret to getting your colour back isn't in a courtroom or a gym, it's hidden in your own nervous system. Drop a ready in the comments if you're tired of feeling invisible, because we're going deep into the architecture of why men like us disappear and how we finally come home to ourselves. Divorce for a man in his second act is a specific kind of violence. It's not the fiery, impulsive breakup of your 20s where you just pack a bag and find a roommate. At 40-something, your life isn't a bag, it's a skyscraper. You've spent decades laying the foundation of your ego with bricks made of provider, protector, and partner. You've defined your worth by the lawn you mowed, the mortgage you carried, and the woman who sat across from you at dinner. When that woman leaves, she doesn't just take her clothes and the good blender, she takes the blueprint of your reality. Milton told me that when the house went quiet, the silence was so loud it actually made his ears ring. He would sit in his leather chair, the one he bought to celebrate a promotion he no longer cared about, and he would feel his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He wasn't just sad, he was experiencing a total system failure. He'd go to work, lead a meeting for 2 hours, and then walk to his car and realize he couldn't remember a single word he'd said. He was the VP from 9 to 5, but the moment he turned the key in the ignition, he became a vacuum. This is the truck hit phase. It's that moment of impact where your brain is trying to reconcile two impossible truths. You are still alive, but the world you lived in is dead. For Milton, the trauma wasn't just in the loss of the woman, it was in the loss of the Times role. He loved being the husband. He loved the weight of the responsibility. Without it, he felt weightless, and weightlessness for a man over 40 feels a lot like dying. He started doing what we all do, he tried to negotiate with the wreckage. He offered to go to more counselling, to take that trip to Tuscany she'd always wanted, to be better. He was trying to buy back his identity with the same currency he used at work, effort and resources. But when she looked at him with those cold, distant eyes and said, "Milton, it's over. I've already moved on," the fixer in him finally broke. He realised he was trying to repair a building that had already been condemned. That's when the grey set in. It's a sensory deprivation that settles over your life like a thick, wet fog. Milton described it as living in a black and white movie while everyone else was in Technicolor. He'd see families at the park and feel a physical ache, not of jealousy but of alienation. He felt like he was behind a thick pane of glass. He was eating, but he couldn't taste the salt. He was sleeping, but he wasn't resting. He was moving through the motions of a successful man, but internally, he was a hollowed-out shell. He started to wonder if he'd ever actually been Milton at all, or if he'd just been a collection of expectations held together by a wedding ring. And that's the scariest question a man can ask himself. Who am I when no one needs me for anything? If you're sitting in that grey right now, I want you to listen closely. You aren't losing your mind. You aren't weak. You are currently trapped in a biological basement that your brain built to keep you from feeling the full force of the explosion. But as Milton was about to find out, staying in that basement for too long is how you become a permanent ghost. He was 1 week away from a professional collapse that would have cost him everything he had left. He was sitting in his office, staring at a contract worth millions, and he realized he didn't care if he signed it or burned it. The ghost was taking over. But then, he saw something in his reflection in the office window that changed everything. A flicker of the man he was at 19, before he ever met her. And for the first time in months, Milton felt a spark of something that wasn't grief. It was a dangerous, quiet, primal curiosity. But as he reached for it, the ghost pushed back, and Milton realized that before he could find himself, he had to figure out who was actually running his body. Because right now, it wasn't him. The silence in a 4-bedroom house after a divorce isn't empty. It's heavy. It has a physical weight, like walking through chest-high water. For Milton, the first Saturday morning alone was the moment the skyscraper officially buckled. He woke up at 6:30 a.m., his body's internal clock still tuned to the rhythm of a life that no longer existed, and reached across the bed. His hand hit cold, flat linen. That microsecond of forgetting, followed by the sledgehammer of remembering, is a cycle that can break a man's spirit before he even brushes his teeth. He laid there staring at the ceiling fan, counting the rotations, and realized that for the first time in 24 years, there was no one to provide for, no one to protect, no one to impress. And in the vacuum of that realization, Milton felt himself start to disappear. This is what we call the structural collapse. When you're a man over 40, your identity isn't just a feeling, it's a series of external scaffolds. You are the VP of operations, the father of 2, the husband of Sarah. You've spent 2 decades building these structures. You thought they were the armor that protected you, but you're realizing now they were actually the only thing holding you upright. Without them, you aren't just single, you're a pile of loose bricks. Milton told me he felt like he was suffering from a phantom limb syndrome, but instead of an arm, it was his entire soul that was missing. He'd walk into the kitchen to make coffee and find himself waiting for a voice to ask him where the car keys were. When the voice didn't come, the husband part of his brain would short-circuit. It was like a computer program trying to run on an operating system that had been deleted. If you're feeling this right now, I want you to understand the mechanics of the crash. You aren't just sad because she's gone. You're in shock because the role you played was your entire definition of being a man. In our society, we don't teach men how to times be, we teach them how to times do. We are human doings, not human beings. So when there is nothing left to do for the marriage, we feel like we've ceased to exist. Milton started spiraling into what I call the fixer's paradox. He began obsessing over the why. He spent hours in the middle of the night scrolling through old texts, looking for the exact moment the leak started. Was it the promotion in 2018? Was it the time I forgot our anniversary? Was I too distant? Was I too controlling? He was trying to use his executive brain, the brain that solves multi-million-dollar logistics problems, to solve a heart that had already moved on. But here's the Hollywood-level twist that Milton didn't see coming. The more he tried to fix the past, the faster he was destroying his future. Every time he sent a rational email to his ex-wife explaining why they should try again, he was actually reinforcing her decision to leave. He was acting from a place of reactive desperation. His nervous system was in a fight state, but there was no one left to fight but himself. He was burning through his emotional reserves at a rate that was physically dangerous. He started losing weight. His hair started thinning. He was a high-performance engine running without any oil, and the friction was starting to melt the gears. One afternoon, Milton was at the office, and his CEO walked in. This was a man Milton had worked with for a decade, a man who respected him, who relied on him. The CEO asked a simple question about the quarterly projections, and Milton just stared at him. He could see the man's lips moving, but the words sounded like they were underwater. In that moment, the VP mask slipped. The CEO's expression shifted from professional curiosity to genuine concern, and then to something Milton feared more than anything: pity. That look of pity was the final blow to his structural integrity. He realized he couldn't even hide in his work anymore. The ghost was visible to everyone. He left the office early that day, driving aimlessly for hours. He ended up at a trailhead near the edge of the city, a place he hadn't visited since he was in his 20s. He sat on the hood of his car, watching the sun dip below the horizon, and for a split second, he felt a strange cold breeze. It wasn't the wind. It was the feeling of total, absolute emptiness. He realized that if he didn't find a way to stand up on his own without the titles, without the house, without the wife, he was going to become a permanent casualty of this divorce. He was at the absolute bottom, but as he sat there in the dark, he realized something terrifying. The person who was supposed to save him didn't exist yet. Have you ever felt like you were waiting for someone to come and tell you it's going to be okay, only to realize that you're the only one in the room? If you have, tell me in the comments what that bottom felt like for you. I will show you how to stop looking at the rubble and start looking at the biology of how you actually rebuild. Milton was about to discover that his numbness wasn't a choice, it was a prison cell with a very specific key. But just as he started to walk back to his car, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from a people you may know algorithm. It was her, and she looked happy. The skyscraper didn't just collapse then, it turned to dust. Milton realized that while he was dying in the grey, she was living in the light, and that anger, that raw primal heat was the first thing he'd felt in months. But was it enough to save him, or was it just the final spark before the burnout? Stay with me, because we're about to go into the biological basement to find out. The anger was a flashbang grenade in a dark room. For a split second, Milton could see everything, the jagged edges of his resentment, the silhouette of his own desperation, and then the ringing in his ears returned, louder than before. He stared at that digital image of his ex-wife, her smile reflecting a version of a life that no longer had a space for him, and he felt a physical hollow form in his gut. It wasn't just the betrayal of her happiness. It was the realization that while he was haunting the hallways of their old life like a Victorian ghost, she had simply stepped out into the sun. He threw his phone onto the passenger seat and sat in the darkness of that trailhead, his breath hitching in a way that felt foreign to a man who had spent 20 years commanding boardrooms. This is the grey plateau, the place where the initial shock wears off and the long cold reality of forever sets in. It's the most dangerous phase for a man over 40 because this is where the numbness stops being a shield and starts becoming a coffin. If you're trapped here, you know the sensation. It's the feeling that the world has lost its resolution. You're watching a low-definition version of your own life. Milton told me that during this week, he stopped tasting his coffee, he stopped hearing the lyrics to the songs on the radio. He was flatlining. In the medical world, they call it anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, but for a man going through an unwanted divorce, it's more like a strategic retreat. Your brain has looked at the emotional carnage of the last few months and decided that the cost of feeling is too high. To protect you from the lethal levels of grief, it has effectively pulled the circuit breaker on your entire emotional grid. You aren't depressed in the way people think, you are unplugged. And the problem with being unplugged is that you can't recharge. Milton tried to will himself out of it. He went to the gym, he lifted weights until his joints screamed, he sat at his desk and stared at spreadsheets until his eyes bled. He was trying to use brute force to override his biology. But here is the Hollywood-level secret that changed Milton's trajectory. You cannot think your way out of a state that your body felt its way into. Your brain's survival center, the amygdala, is currently convinced that you are being hunted by a predator. It doesn't care about your quarterly reports or your desire to feel like yourself. It only cares that you stay small, stay quiet, and stay numb so the predator doesn't see you. For Milton, the predator was the shame of failure. Every time he thought about his role as a husband, his body triggered a flight or fight response so intense that his brain had to shut down just to keep his heart from exploding. This is the biological basement. It's where your healthy self, the guy who is funny, creative, and confident, is being held hostage by your reactive self. Milton realized that he was living in a loop. He'd wake up, feel the truck hit, go into survival mode at work, and then come home to the grey fog. It was a closed circuit. He was waiting for the divorce to be over so he could feel better, but he was starting to realize that the divorce was never going to be over as long as his body was still living in the moment of impact. He was 44 years old, and he was physically aging a year every month. He saw a photo of himself from a year ago and didn't recognize the man in the frame. The man in the photo had light in his eyes. The man in the mirror looked like a charcoal sketch of a person. One night, Milton found himself in his garage at 2 a.m. He was sitting on the concrete floor, surrounded by boxes of things he had moved out of the master bedroom. He opened a crate he hadn't touched in a decade. Inside was a set of old architectural drafting tools, the heavy, brass kind from before everything went digital. He picked up a compass, the cold metal biting into his palm, and for the first time in months, he felt a tether. It wasn't a fix. It wasn't a solution to his marriage. It was a sensory input that didn't belong to the VP or the husband. It belonged to the student, the guy who used to stay up all night drawing structures because he loved the way lines met in space. For 3 seconds, the grey fog parted, and Milton felt a tiny microscopic pulse of genuine curiosity. He realized in that garage that he had spent 20 years building a life for them, and in the process, he had let the me starve to death. He had outsourced his joy to his wife and his purpose to his company. Now that the contract was cancelled, he was bankrupt. But that brass compass felt like a lifeline. He realized that if he was going to survive the next 30 days, he had to stop trying to recover his marriage and start excavating his soul. He had to go deeper than the roles. He had to find the core essence that existed before he ever said, "I do." But as he sat there, the reactive self roared back. A thought hit him like a physical blow. It's too late. You're 44. You're damaged goods. Nobody wants the guy on the garage floor. The numbness tried to settle back in, but the anger from the trailhead was still there, smouldering. Milton stood up, his knees cracking in the silence, and he made a choice. He wasn't going to wait to feel better. He was going to regulate. He didn't know how yet, but he knew that if he stayed in this basement one more night, he'd never come out. Have you ever had that moment where you realize that if you don't change times right now, you are going to disappear forever? Drop a yes in the comments if you've stood on that ledge. Because the next part is where we move from the why to the how. Milton was about to discover the neurohack that brings the colour back, but first, he had to survive a confrontation at the office that would threaten to strip away the last mask he had left. The ghost was about to meet the machine, and only one of them was walking out of that boardroom alive. The boardroom at 8 a.m. on a Tuesday is a cathedral of high-stakes logic, but for Milton, it felt like a firing squad. He was sitting at the head of the mahogany table, the same table where he'd negotiated mergers that made headlines, and he realized he was vibrating. It wasn't a visible shake, not yet, but an internal frequency, a hum of pure, unadulterated static. His chief operations officer was mid-sentence, pointing at a slide deck that detailed a 12% dip in regional efficiency, and Milton couldn't process the numbers. The digits on the screen looked like ancient hieroglyphics. His executive self, the version of Milton that was a machine of precision and cold calculation, was offline. In its place was a biological wreck, a man whose amygdala had hijacked the cockpit. This is the midpoint pivot, the moment where the ghost finally meets the machine, and you realize that your career cannot save your soul. If you've ever sat in a meeting while your life was imploding, you know this specific brand of horror. It's the imposter syndrome on steroids. You're terrified that someone is going to look at you and realize that the man in the $3,000 suit is actually a hollowed-out shell. Milton felt the sweat pooling at the small of his back. He felt his heart rate climbing 110, 120, 130 beats per minute while he was just sitting still. His body was preparing for a physical fight that didn't exist. This is what we call autonomic dysregulation. Because Milton hadn't slept in a week, and because his husband identity had been ripped away, his nervous system was stuck in a high-alert loop. He wasn't unprofessional. He was biologically overtaxed. He was a Ferrari being driven in first gear at 100 miles an hour. The engine was about to throw a rod. The COO stopped talking. The room went silent. 5 pairs of eyes turned toward Milton, waiting for the VP to provide the solution. Milton opened his mouth, and for 3 agonizing seconds, nothing came out. The silence stretched until it became a physical weight. He looked at his reflection in the glass wall of the boardroom and saw the fading man again. But then, he remembered the brass compass in his garage. He remembered the feeling of the cold metal. He took a breath, not a shallow, panicked chest breath, but a deep diaphragmatic pull, and he did something he had never done in 20 years of corporate life. He said, "I need 5 minutes. Let's take a break." He walked out of that room, locked himself in the executive restroom, and splashed ice-cold water on his face. This was the first step of nervous system regulation. He wasn't trying to think his way into being a VP again. He was trying to cool the hardware. He stood there, gripping the edge of the marble sink, and forced his exhale to be twice as long as his inhale. He was manually overriding the lion attack signal. He was telling his brain, "The marriage is over, but we are not dying right now. This is the neurohack that the grey world hides from you. You don't need a new wife or a new car to feel like a man. You need to regain the remote control to your own biology." When Milton walked back into that boardroom, he wasn't happy Milton yet, but he was grounded Milton. He sat down, looked at the numbers, and for the first time in months, they made sense. He didn't give a hero speech. He gave a clear, quiet directive. He realized in that moment that his work wasn't his identity, it was just a theater he performed in. The VP was a mask, the husband was a mask, but the man who had just regulated his own heart rate in a bathroom stall, that was someone new. That was a man who was starting to build a foundation on something internal, something that didn't require a woman's permission to exist. He left the office that day feeling a strange, quiet hum of victory. It wasn't a shouting from the rooftops kind of win, it was the quiet click of a key turning in a lock. He drove home, and for the first time, he didn't turn on the radio to drown out the silence. He let the silence sit in the car with him. He was starting to realize that the grey wasn't a permanent state, it was just the colour of the fog before the sun comes up. He was 44, his house was empty, and his legal fees were mounting. But as he pulled into his driveway, he noticed the way the evening light hit the trees. He noticed the deep, burning orange of the sunset. He realized he was seeing time's colour again. But as he walked through his front door, he saw a FedEx envelope tucked into the frame. He knew what it was before he touched it. The final decree. The legal death certificate of his 22-year history. The ghost made one last grab for the wheel, whispering that this tiny bit of progress was a lie, that the colour was just a hallucination. Milton took the envelope to his kitchen table, but he didn't open it. He sat there in the dim light of the kitchen, looking at the white paper, and he felt the old panic rising. Would he revert to the man on the garage floor, or was the machine finally strong enough to handle the truth? We're heading into a territory where most men turn back. We're going to look at the professional imposter and see what happens when you stop pretending. If you've ever had a victory followed immediately by a gut punch, stay with me. Because what Milton did with that envelope is going to show you exactly how to stop being a victim of your own history. The FedEx envelope sat on the granite island like an unexploded pipe bomb, in the sterile, overhead glow of a kitchen that used to smell like garlic and sound like laughter. Milton stared at his own name, typed in a font that looked like a court summons. This was the finality. The legal severing of 22 years of history. Any other night, this would have been the moment Milton reached for the scotch or the phone to plead one last time. But something had shifted in that executive restroom. The machine wasn't just a metaphor anymore, it was a manual override. He didn't open the envelope, he didn't even touch it. He walked to the sink, filled a glass with water, and watched his hand. It was steady. This is the imposter's revelation, the moment you realize that the world's definition of your end doesn't have to be yours. If you're a man over 40, your greatest fear isn't just the divorce, it's the loss of face. It's the idea that your colleagues, your neighbours, and your own children see you as a failed project. Milton spent the next morning back at the office, but the VP mask felt different. It was lighter. He realized that for 2 decades he had been performing competence to justify his existence to a woman who had already checked out years ago. He had been a high achiever not because he loved the work, but because he was terrified of being nothing. Now that the nothing had arrived, now that the house was quiet and the marriage was a legal file, the fear had lost its teeth. When you have nothing left to lose, you gain a terrifying professional superpower: sovereignty. He sat in a high-level strategy meeting that afternoon, and for the first time, he didn't care about being the smartest man in the room. He didn't interrupt. He didn't posture. He simply observed. He saw his colleagues sweating over optics and ego, and he felt a strange sense of distance. He was the professional imposter, but in reverse. He was pretending to care about the corporate ladder while his internal world was busy building a mountain. This is the B story of every successful man's recovery. You stop using your job as a bandage for your bleeding identity and start using it as a training ground for your new self. Milton realized that if he could regulate his heart rate while a CEO was screaming about margins, he could handle a Saturday night alone in a silent house. But the ghost always saves its best trick for the drive home. About 6 p.m., as the sun began to dip and the grey fog tried to roll back in, Milton felt the familiar pull of the nostalgia trap. His brain began to play a greatest hits reel of his marriage, the first house, the way she used to tuck her hair behind her ear, the sound of the kids running down the hallway. It was a sensory assault designed to pull him back into the reactive basement. His heart started to pick up speed. The numbness threatened to return. But instead of fighting the thoughts, Milton used a technique we call the observer shift. He looked at the thoughts like they were slides in a projector. There is a memory of a vacation. There is a feeling of loneliness. There is a sensation of heat in my chest. By labeling the experience, he disconnected the identity from the event. He wasn't lonely Milton, he was Milton, noticing a feeling of loneliness. That small linguistic shift is the difference between drowning and swimming. He pulled into his driveway, walked past the FedEx envelope still sitting on the counter, and went straight to the garage. He didn't go to the Scotch. He went back to the old drafting tools. He spent 3 hours drawing the lines of a structure that didn't exist yet, a house of his own design, built for a man who didn't need anyone else's approval to be whole. He was excavating the core. He was finding the guy who liked geometry, who liked the smell of pencil lead, who liked the silence of creation. The ghost was screaming that he was wasting his time, that he should be fixing his life. But Milton just kept drawing. He was building a nervous system that could handle the truth. By midnight, the grey hadn't just parted, it had evaporated. He felt a level of clarity that was almost vibrating. He looked at the FedEx envelope and finally picked it up. He tore it open, scanned the legalese and signed his name. He didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just felt finished. The role of husband was officially retired. The costume was in the trash. But as he turned off the garage lights, he caught his reflection in the window of his car. The fading man was gone. In his place was someone with a hard, quiet edge. A man who had survived the demolition and was now standing on the raw, open ground of his own life. But there was one final test. As he walked toward the stairs, his phone lit up. A text from her. Not a legal one, not a cold one, just 3 words. Are you okay? The ghost surged one last time, a desperate final attempt to hook him back into the old cycle of maybe and what if. The temptation to reply, to pour out his progress, to show her how well he was doing, was a physical ache in his throat. Milton stood at the bottom of the stairs, the blue light of the phone illuminating a face that had finally stopped disappearing. He realized that his answer to those 3 words would determine if he was truly sovereign or just a well-regulated prisoner. If you've ever been one text message away from undoing 6 months of healing, you need to see what happened next. Because the sovereign act isn't about what you say, it's about what you finally stop needing to hear. The blue light of the phone was a siren song, a digital ghost trying to pull Milton back into a shipwreck he had already survived. Are you okay? In the old world, those 3 words would have been a lifeline. He would have spent 3 hours crafting a response that balanced "I'm strong" with "I miss you," a desperate attempt to stay relevant in her story. But as he stood there in the silence of his kitchen, Milton realized that answering her wouldn't be an act of kindness, it would be an act of self-betrayal. He looked at the message and felt nothing. No spike in his heart rate, no cold sweat, just a quiet, objective observation of a closed chapter. He didn't delete the text, he didn't block the number. He simply set the phone face down on the granite and walked away. This is the sovereign act, the moment you realize that your peace is no longer up for negotiation. If you're a man over 40, your second act doesn't start when the decree is signed. It starts when you stop seeking a witness for your pain. For 22 years, Milton's reality had been validated by Sarah's perspective. If she was happy, he was successful. If she was cold, he was a failure. He had outsourced the manual of Milton to someone else. But as he sat in his garage that night, looking at the architectural drawings he'd created, he realized the fading man had finally stopped disappearing because he was no longer looking for his reflection in someone else's eyes. He was the architect now. He was the one holding the pen. He spent the next hour not in grief, but in pure, unadulterated flow. He wasn't VP Milton or ex-husband Milton. He was just a man, a nervous system, and a set of lines on a page. The colour didn't just come back into the world, it exploded. He started noticing things he hadn't seen since his 20s, the way the shadows moved across the floor, the specific scent of the rain on the pavement, the taste of a single, crisp apple. This is the return of the healthy self. When you regulate your biology, you don't just get over the divorce. You gain access to a version of yourself that is actually superior to the one that entered the marriage. You're wiser, you're grounded, and you've survived the worst-case scenario. You are the man who walked through the fire and realized he was the one who controlled the flames. Milton went back to that grocery store a week later. He stood in the same aisle, aisle 4, in front of the same wall of pasta sauce. But this time, there was no paralysis. There was no ghost. He didn't look for the brand they used to buy. He didn't look for the one she liked. He reached out, grabbed a jar of spicy arrabbiata because Timesy Times liked the heat, and he kept walking. It was a small victory, but it was a total one. He was a man who knew his own mind. He was 44 years old. His life was completely different than he'd imagined it would be. But for the first time in his adult life, he felt safe. Not because the world was safe, but because Times was a safe place for himself to live. If you're watching this right now and you feel like the ghost in the mirror, I want you to hear me. The divorce didn't break you. It just broke the costume you were wearing. The man you miss, the happy, confident, energized guy, isn't gone. He's just waiting for you to stop the survival loop so he can come back to the surface. You don't need a time machine. You need a roadmap for your own biology. Here is the best advice I can give to any man over 40 standing in the rubble. Stop trying to save the husband. He's dead. Start saving the man. Your worth was never tied to your marriage certificate, and your future isn't defined by your past mistakes. The most attractive, powerful, and unshakable version of you is the one who doesn't need a role to feel like a king. You are the architect of your second act. Don't let anyone else hold the blueprint. If Milton's story hit you where you live, if you're ready to stop the fading and start the reconstruction, do 3 things for me right now. Like this video so other men in the grey fog can find it. Comment the word sovereign below if you're ready to take back the pen. And subscribe to join this community of men who are redefining what it means to be a leader in their own lives. We aren't just surviving divorce, we're outgrowing it. It's time to get your colour back. Milton did it in 30 days. You can start today. I'll see you on the other side of the grey. Stay grounded, stay sharp, and remember, the second half of the game is where the real legends are made.